What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another Datasheet Deep Dive, the Warhammer 40k series where we take a datasheet in the game and analyze it in excruciating detail. And today we're talking about maybe one of the most polarizing characters in all of Warhammer 40k. You either love this guy or you hate this guy. It is Be'lakor, the Dark Master of the Chaos Demons. And in this video, we're going to be breaking down this Demon Prince's profile, talking about synergies to use with him in the faction, and asking ourselves the question, is he worth taking? I don't say it often enough on this channel, but if you enjoy the Datasheet Deep Dive series, please consider dropping a like on the video and a subscribe on the channel if you haven't already. Inky would really appreciate it, apparently. Yeah, okay, cat, Jesus. So let's start off by jumping into Be'lakor's datasheet and talking about his statistics. He comes in at kind of an average stat line, to be honest, especially for a large monster such as he is. He has a 12-inch movement. He does have the fly keyword, but that 12-inch movement is a little slow. It's not quite enough to really get him around many buildings, and while there are ways to give him slight speed boosts in the faction, they typically come with some downside. So while he is an above average speed for a mostly melee-oriented monster, he's certainly not winning any awards for his ability to sprint. He has a mediocre toughness of 10, and like most greater demons, kind of mid-save characteristics. This includes a 4+ armor save and invulnerable save. So interestingly, in many situations, and this actually comes up quite often because of how large and voluminous Be'lakor's physical model is, he will be benefiting from cover against AP0 attacks, meaning that you can theoretically get this guy to a 3+ save. Now, there is some anti-synergy that we'll talk about later on in the video with taking cover saves on Be'lakor, but it is theoretically possible, although very rare. Those 4+ saves are protecting 18 wounds, and he comes in with an average leadership characteristic of 6. He does have some ways to buff this, however, and an OC value of 5, which is very impressive and a characteristic shared by the other greater demons in the faction. Now, the highlight of Be'lakor's datasheet are his incredible special abilities. He has some of the most powerful support effects in 40k. But first, let's talk about his weapons, because his weapons are kind of the opposite, especially in Chaos Demons, a faction where these enormous monster characters are responsible for most of the army's actual damage. Be'lakor comes in with a very mediocre offensive profile. He has a ranged attack in his Betraying Shades, a focusable psychic power that inflicts devastating wounds and ignores cover. It starts with 9 strength 5 AP2 1 damage attacks that hit on 2s and can be overcharged to go to strength 6 AP3 with 12 attacks. This is actually probably a highlight of his profile. The Betraying Shades are a very nice ranged attack to have. That super high volume, high consistency anti-infantry gun is something that demons kind of lack a little bit, especially given the fact that it punches through armor saves, which can be problematic for the faction. Being AP3 with devastating wounds and ignoring cover means that he's putting basically all 3+ armor save infantry on a 3+ save, unless you have some sort of armor of contempt effect, and many light infantry just die to this guy. He probably averages somewhere around 7 or 8 converted attacks into most units, so he's not good at killing entire 10-man units of light infantry, but he is good at killing smaller 5-man units or putting enough damage into something like 5 tactical marines, for example, that you can follow it up with another ranged attack or a small charge and knock those units out. He can also combo together with some other ranged attackers to put some damage onto heavier targets, especially if you have some of the combinations that we are going to talk about later on in this video. He actually starts to get to some, I don't want to say impressive damage characteristics, but definitely appreciable damage characteristics. The opposite is true, however, for his melee attack, the Blade of Shadows. Now, on its face, this might look like a pretty good profile. He has a strike and sweep attack. His strike, it has lethal hits and swings for 6. Weapon skill 2, strength 14, AP4, D6 plus 1 attacks. His sweep attack moves to 14 attacks at strength 8 AP3 for only 1 damage, and kind of continues the trend of Be'lakor being an absolute blender of 1 wound infantry. The real downside for Be'lakor in this case, however, is that strike attack and its inconsistency. Be'lakor has no access to rerolls of any kind outside of just the normal command reroll, and in every season of 40k so far, he has cost more than 300 points. So unfortunately, on average, this strike profile probably drops 1 attack on the hit and wound roll. If your opponent has an invulnerable saving throw, armor of contempt, or a strong saving throw as well, he can oftentimes get blanked on one of his converted attacks as well, meaning he's probably only putting 3 of these attacks through on most vehicles. vehicles, if that, meaning that he typically on average converts 2 to 3 attacks on most vehicles in the game. At d6 plus 1 damage, that sounds pretty good, but it leaves most targets alive and then allows Be'lakor to get counterattack. And especially as Be'lakor is a monster that wants to kind of stay as far away from enemies as possible. We just discussed how his defensive profile is fairly mediocre, and he has very few other defensive mechanics to protect him. Getting up close and personal with an attack that is as inconsistent as the Blade of Shadows is, can oftentimes spell doom for a demon's army, because if he fails to kill whatever he's attacking, or even if he kills it and is too close to a very powerful enemy unit, he'll just die and you lose your 300 plus point utility piece. And that's kind of where the controversy of Be'lakor arises. He is one of the most incredible force multipliers in the game, but also doesn't really contribute that much to your army, at least not doing so profitably. And demons being a typically low unit count army that needs very reliable attacks in order to get their value, it's not a great place for Be'lakor to be sitting. Now, I've mentioned a couple times these force multiplication effects, and what exactly are they? The first is Be'lakor's Dark Master ability. This treats the area of the battlefield within 6 inches of him as to be within the shadow of chaos. This effect is absolutely enormous, although with the Pariah Nexus update, now projecting a pseudo Shadow of Chaos aura from all of the army's greater demons, it is less necessary. Previously, Be'lakor kind of was required in order for your army to get Shadow of Chaos when you weren't dominating primary objectives, in which case you were probably winning anyway, so you didn't necessarily need to be in that Shadow of Chaos. However, now greater demons and most of your internal synergies turn on when you are near those other big monsters. The big benefit that Be'lakor has here, however, is that his is not keyed to a specific allegiance keyword. Other greater demons only affect friendly demons with their Shadow of Chaos if they share the god keyword, so Khorne, Slaanesh, Tzeentch, Nurgle, etc. Be'lakor does not have that problem. He is an equal opportunity employer, and he is able to buff anyone in that aura. Now, what exactly does that let you do? First off, it affects both friendly and enemy models. Enemy models get the army penalty of -1 to battle shock checks and mortal wounds if they fail it. Friendly models get the opposite of that, +1 to those battle shock checks and healing wounds when they succeed them. And that is one way that Be'lakor's Leadership 6 does get improved. He's basically Leadership 5 in most instances, and with as effective as passing battle shock checks are for demons, that's a big deal. In addition, he also allows units to deep strike 6 inches away from enemies if they are wholly within that Shadow of Chaos area. Now, this is a little controversial, but this doesn't affect Be'lakor himself when he's set up on the table, although that does get ruled differently occasionally based on where you're playing, so definitely check with your local community about that. Essentially, Be'lakor has to be on the battlefield for there to be an area of the battlefield within 6 inches of him, and while a unit is always considered to be within their own aura, he's not considered to be in that area on the battlefield before he sets up, so before you place him on the table, he can't place closer than 9 inches to anyone if he deep strikes. Other units, however, if you start with Be'lakor, can set up closer to enemies than the normal 9 inches thanks to the detachment ability, and again, this is untyped to a keyword, unlike the other greater demons, so he acts as a delivery system for basically anything else in the codex. You can be dropping bloodthirsters or bloodletters or slash demons or getting lines of sight with Tzeentch guns, regardless of that allegiance keyword, and that makes him support a combined allegiance army very effectively. Now, a weird idiosyncrasy about this effect when you're setting up models is that this essentially extends the existing Shadow of Chaos to that area that Be'lakor is near, which can create some odd situations. In order to benefit from the Demonic Incursion detachment ability, your unit has to be placed wholly within Shadow of Chaos, but it doesn't have to be placed wholly within one Shadow of Chaos. So you can chain, for example, Be'lakor's 6-inch aura, the 6-inch aura from Corrupt Real Space, and the standard Shadow of Chaos area that may be applied thanks to objective controls together to make some really weird shadows across the table that your units are then able to deep strike in. Essentially, you can do stuff like place half of your unit wholly within your deployment zone, which is always Shadow of Chaos, a couple models wholly within 6 inches of Be'lakor, maintaining coherency, and a couple models wholly within 6 inches of an objective marker. All of those models are wholly within Shadow of Chaos if they're entirely inside those auras, and so that's a totally legal placement, which can catch some people off guard sometimes who think that you can't fit into your normal shadow. Now, while that's a powerful effect in Pariah Nexus thanks to the Greater Demon update, it is largely a quality of life improvement, but the Shadow Form ability is the actual reason that you're taking Be'lakor. This is a Primarch style ability, and at the start of the battle round, you get to choose one effect on his datasheet that he applies for the remainder of the battle round. This includes some decidedly mid battle shock manipulation, including Pall of Despair, which forces enemies to take battle shock checks in their battle shock step if they are below their starting strength rather than below half strength. Unfortunately, because these effects were FAQ'd to not work if the unit is already taking a battle shock check, they're not actually that good. So outside of extremely specific circumstances where, for example, you're going first and see an opportunity to threaten a really annoying battle shock check on a unit that is already within 6 inches of Bellicor and could decidedly change the game state if they failed that check and are below starting strength, you're probably never going to choose this one. Shadow Lord is the next one. It allows your friendly demons to reroll battle shock and leadership tests within 6 inches. This is another way that you can compound the reliability of Bellicor and his army's battle shock checks. And because those units within 6 inches are always in Shadow of Chaos, they are always going to be benefiting from +1 leadership, and they're always going to be regenerating models if they pass those checks. So getting rerolls on them is a huge deal. There are some matchups that force tons of battle shock checks. Tyranids are a good example where this ability is an absolute disaster for them. You have an insane reliability on your battle shock, and the battle shock just accrues value if you pass them, which you will do probably 90+% of the time. If you are keeping your army condensed around Bellicor, it is probably unreasonable for your opponent to ever trigger Shadow in the Warp. Now that we have units like the Calexis Assassin who can also do something similar, and as we see more battle shock forcing effects included in the game, this ability just improves in value. Now the last one is the big ability on his datasheet. This is Wreathed in Shadow. This gives friendly Legiones Daemonica units within 6 inches of Bellicor a lone operative style effect. Your unit can only be targeted by a ranged attack if the attacking model is within 18 inches. And this ability is fucking nuts. First off, there's a couple little things to keep in mind here. It affects units, not models. So if you have a large unit, for example, 10 Plague Bearers, and one Plague Bearer is within 6 inches of Bellicor, and the rest of the Plague Bearers are strung all the way throughout your deployment zone on every single objective and maybe into the middle of the table, the entire unit is affected by Wreathed in Shadows. In addition, that measurement is taken between models and not units, which means that a unit with a single model within 18 inches of one of your models benefiting from Wreathed in Shadow can still target that unit, but only the single model that is within 18 inches can actually select those units as an eligible target. Now, to be fair, 18 inches is a lot, and in 10th edition, with the board so condensed into the center of the table, this will largely only come into play on the first or second battle round, unless you are playing an extremely cagey game against a ranged, focused opponent. Most of the time, your opponent is going to be able to move up within that 18 inches and shoot you. But here's the other hidden benefit of Wreathed in Shadows, which is that your opponent then has to move up within 18 inches of your army to shoot you. And demons, being a relatively high threat range, melee-focused faction with short-ranged ranged attacks, absolutely loves it when the other player moves out of their hidey holes into the center of the table and takes the fight to the demon player. This then potentially allows you to counter-attack with your exceptionally strong melee demons. Units like Bloodthirsters, for example, are just going to hammer blow anyone who moves up into this range in order to attack you on the counterattack. And that is additionally buffed by Bellicor because he can be moving forward and then dropping those units off 6 inches away from him to then charge. And that's kind of the intended play pattern of this character. He wants to be standing somewhere around the middle or back of your deployment zone, protecting your greater demons and forcing your opponent to wildly overextend in order to attack you. If they choose to do so, he can then summon demons from either Deep Strike or using the demonic uppy downy and hammer back into that opposing army to punish them for their hubris. And now, before we move off of talking about Bellicor's datasheet, there's a couple other things that I think it's important to note. First off, Bellicor does have stealth, so he does protect himself a little bit. He also deadly demises for d6 damage like most of the greater demons, which it can be unfortunate for you if he dies early and is trying to protect your army, so most of your army is within 6 inches of him. He can actually inflict kind of an insane number of mortal wounds on you if things go poorly. An inopportune Bellicor detonation can not only remove a lot of his defensive effects, but then also do damage to your army and sometimes end the game, which is a little unfortunate. In addition, he also has the Supreme Commander effect, so he must be your army's warlord. That's not the biggest of deals, but it does mean that you have to kind of baby him in matchups where the warlord selection matters. This means that against Imperial Knights, for example, he can't run up the table and be very aggressive. And if you're trying to complete secret missions in the Pariah Nexus mission set and trying to get something like Command Insertion, for example, Bellicor is important to keep alive in order to make that happen. That actually makes Command Insertion kind of difficult because, as I mentioned before, Bellicor is not that hard to kill, and he is largely melee focused. So at some point in the game, he wants to get up in your opponent's face and try to actually use that mediocre sword he has, and if he does so, he could just die and remove that secret mission from the pool. Now, moving on from that, let's talk about some faction synergies. We can first talk about a couple of data sheets that he has synergy with. To be honest though, Bellicor is the one doing the synergizing. He is less a recipient of synergies, so there's not much to talk about here. He lacks any allegiance keyword, so it doesn't benefit from any of those internal sub-faction abilities. However, auras and things can affect him. The Mask of Slanesh, for example, can choose an enemy unit within 6 inches in the fight phase, and they get -1 to wound, which can protect Be'lakor and other greater demons like him. I mentioned as well that you can combo together some damage out of his ranged weapon attack. This can be done with the Great Unclean One, who can reduce the toughness characteristic of enemy units, regardless of who's attacking them. That effectively makes Be'lakor's gun somewhere around strength 7-ish, and gives him a lot more expected damage into T12 enemies. Especially with the high AP and ignore cover, that gives Be'lakor, I don't want to say good damage output into heavy vehicles, things like Land Raiders and stuff, but it's definitely not bad damage output. He's probably good for 3 or 4 damage, which combined with the other ranged attacks in the demon army can stack up quite a bit. I think it's also important to note that movement reduction effects can have a good synergy with Be'lakor because he wants to play a threat range game, and playing Be'lakor effectively requires you to measure out very carefully how far away you are from enemies to ensure that they can't move inside your 18-inch lone operative range. Having units like the Exalted Flamer to potentially reduce enemy movement characteristics, or even Rodagus running up the center of the table to have enemy movement, can make it more difficult to get to grips with Be'lakor or the demons he's protecting. Now moving on to in-faction synergies. At the time of recording, Demonic Incursion is the only detachment for Chaos Demons. However, basically all of the Demonic Incursion effects synergize incredibly well with Be'lakor. I think to the point that basically these two were designed in concert. First off, the Realm of Chaos gives you an uppy-downy effect. You can affect 2 units in your army's Shadow of Chaos. So Be'lakor kind of initiates this very well because he and one other thing within 6 inches of him are always going to be within Shadow of Chaos. So you almost always have 2 units that you can choose to Realm of Chaos into reserve. Once in reserve, you can use Denizens of the Warp to come down 3 inches away from enemies, and that allows Be'lakor to get his Shadow of Chaos aura close up to enemies to then drop units off 6 inches away from them. This makes it incredibly difficult to screen demon armies, and is one of the big benefits of playing demons. Your models might be relatively easy to kill and sometimes fairly pillow-fisted, but you can basically get them almost anywhere on the table that you want to, unless your opponent has an effect like Omni Scramblers. If you want Be'lakor to do some additional damage, you can use Draught of Terror to improve his armor penetration characteristics. This also has an additional benefit of rerolling wound rolls if your opponent is battle shocked. That can potentially give you a use case for Ball of Despair to make enemies take battle shock checks more often to potentially then reroll wound rolls against them. But a little bit of an unfortunate piece of demon faction design is that they have these battle shock mechanics that benefit when enemies fail battle shock checks, but have basically no way to force them outside of normal battle shock checks the normal way. And typically as a demon player, you want to be just killing your opponent's units, otherwise they're going to punch back into you and probably do a lot of damage. Warp Surge also allows Be'lakor to get around the table fairly quickly. If you don't care about shooting Be'lakor's gun, advancing him up the table can be a good way to get him into a position to either charge and get his melee attacks online, or then drop other demons out in relevant parts of the table. Oftentimes your opponent is screening out your ability to just Realm of Chaos up and down into a position where you can get Be'lakor where you want him, and just advancing into that position also works most of the time. The downside is losing the attack from his gun because it is not an assault weapon, and that's sad because it is just a good gun, but getting this big support piece where you need him to is oftentimes more valuable. Last and maybe least, Demonic Invulnerability gives him a little bit of defense. This is a stratagem only usable in the shooting phase. It's important to note that you can't use it against melee attacks, which I have seen sometimes. That is not legal. It gives you reroll 1s on your invulnerable saving throws. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that there actually is some anti-synergy with taking cover saves on Be'lakor, and this is it. If you are trying to keep him alive, and he does have stealth, so he can be -1 to hit, and having a bunch of wounds in this reroll can sometimes keep him going for a while, and you choose to take a cover save, Demonic Invulnerability actually turns off for that saving throw. It doesn't work because you're then taking an armor save, not an invulnerable save, and thereby don't get the reroll. Being Demonic Invulnerability, it does make sense that it only works on invulnerable saving throws, but for 4+ base armor save demons, there is a little bit of lost efficiency. And so with all of that taken into account, let's discuss, is Be'lakor worth taking in a demon army? And I think the answer is a decided maybe. At the beginning of the edition, I think that Be'lakor was kind of required to make demons work. Demons without access to Shadow of Chaos, especially the greater demons, it kind of fell apart a little bit as a faction, not being able to get any of the benefits from their up-buffed enhancements, and being ripped apart by long-range enemy ranged attacks was just a bad time. But now that greater demons also project a Shadow of Chaos aura, Be'lakor feels less important. However, his value is directly proportional to the number of long-range guns in the metagame. One downside that demons have is a susceptibility to just being shot with a regular gun, which is unfortunate for an army that's mostly built around around punching people in melee or shooting them from a very short distance. Bellicor allows you to play a more ranged focused game, or at least a game where you play with threat ranges without just being ripped off the table by enemy long range guns. So I think his value increases significantly if there are strong ranged attacks that do shoot a long distance and don't have maybe the longest movement characteristic ever in the meta. Right now, Adeptus Sororitas are absolutely ripping it up, and units like Castigators are a disaster for demons. Unless they're comboed out, they start with kind of a low AP value, but pretty solid attacks at a high volume and also high damage, which is exactly what you don't want to see as a demons player. And those units will essentially just table a demons army by themselves if you don't have Bellicor to protect you. You can try to play out of line of sight, but unfortunately, so many armies have so many small utility units right now that they will simply outscore you if you allow them to. And Bellicor allows you to engage with those little forward operators and other utility units without immediately losing your greater demons to enemy guns. The downside is that you are basically taking an entire greater demons worth of points for significantly less damage output, but you do have the upside of not requiring your army to be a single allegiance keyword for all your demons to benefit from your Shadow of Chaos auras, which allows you to play a little bit more of a combined army. Currently, I do think demons are most effective as a mixed allegiance army, taking a little bit of Slanesh, Nurgle, Tzeentch, and Khorne all together makes them stronger than the sum of their parts, and Bellicor is kind of the glue that very haphazardly keeps that shoddily assembled construct together. He's not amazing glue. He's like Elmer's wood glue after it rains and you leave it out in the sun for a couple of days. So if you apply almost any pressure at all to the point of connection, it's just going to fall apart pretty quickly, but at least there is glue there, and at least your army is not immediately folding to anyone with a gun at all.
Predator down here.
Into the Bloodthirster, both go through.
Yahtzee.
14, sure.
Other Predator is going to do everything into that, your guy, so Lascans first.
One goes through, sure.
5 damage.
Sure. Why wouldn't I die to 2 Predators? Fucking 70% of my points value with a melee unit.
They ask you how you are, and you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it.
Let's see if Elmer can't do something about this.
In situations where you can get away without Bellicor, you definitely don't really miss him. It is nice to be able to take an additional Bloodthirster or a Lord of Change or something in that spot and not pay for what is probably an overcosted Demon Prince. So in team formats, for example, where you can try to dodge matchups where Bellicor is required, or if your metagame just tends to be more melee oriented and not have the same breadth of ranged attacks, you can leave Bellicor at home and probably feel pretty good about it. You do lose a little bit in that Shadow of Chaos, allowing him to drop anybody off the table that you want to, but you can get around that by focusing on specific allegiance keywords and just generally playing a little smarter. I know Bellicor is a bit of a controversial character, so let me know down in the comment section what you think about him. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, as well as YouTube channel members and Twitch subscribers. I am uploading new patron videos a little bit more consistently now that I'm playing around with a lot more interesting army builds. So if you are at the exclusive video tiers on the YouTube membership or on the Patreon, you'll be getting access to those in the coming weeks. And with that, I'll sign off. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.